prophet Habakkuk was confused. God seemed to be allowing evil and immorality to continue without dealing with it. Foreign nations kept invading their cities. But Habakkuk's unfailing trust in God drove him to the Lord to understand what was going on. And God answered him, affirming that he was still in control. The invading Chaldeans were being used by him, as it says in chapter 1, verse 6 of Habakkuk. And though God was using the evil nations, he didn't approve of the evil they were doing. Verse 11 makes that very clear. And then in verse 12, we see Habakkuk responded by rejoicing in the revealed glory of God. He knew the Lord was still in control, but the prophet was still confused. He didn't understand how it all fit together, and he began to express that confusion in verses 13 to 17. In our last study, we looked at God's reply to him again at the beginning of chapter 2, the first 4 verses. And there God commanded the prophet to write down a vision he was giving him. The soul of the proud is not right inside him. It's off course. But in contrast, the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. In other words, that's the contrast here. Even when he doesn't have all the answers, he has a firm, uncompromising confidence, a faith in the divine promises. Now, the details behind the workings of God may have been hidden from him, but he trusted that what God had revealed was sufficient. And so the book continues now as the Lord gives Habakkuk a poem for the proud. And in it, the Lord describes something about the proud people that he's writing about here. And the poem begins in verse 5. Here in chapter 2, verse 5, it says, "Indeed, because he transgresses by wine, he is a proud man and does not stay at home. Because he enlarges his desire as hell, and he is like death and cannot be satisfied. He gathers to himself all nations and heaps up for himself all peoples. Will not all these take up a proverb against him and a taunting riddle against him?" Now, the Neo-Babylonian oppressors were very much addicted to the excessive use of wine. According to ancient records, the Chaldeans abused it continually. We remember Belshazzar's riotous banquet in the book of Daniel. And Proverbs 23:21 warns, it says, "For the drunkard and the glutton will come to poverty." So they weren't just drinking wine as a beverage. They were drinking it as an intoxicant. And the enemy of the redeemed was proud. His arrogance just revealed how he puts himself over the glory and importance of his Creator. Self-importance is a common characteristic of those who aren't to be trusted. When decisions come along that affect other people, they will always choose what promotes their own power, peace, and prosperity at the expense of everyone else. He neglects his own home, it says. He's abandoned God's family, and he will find no rest in his earthly home either. He wanders looking for security, and he will not find it. And so the oppressor has this insatiable appetite to feed his hungry desires. Now, he's like hell, it says. The Hebrew word there is Sheol. It's often translated the grave. It's the place where the dead go, and it has a wide range of meanings. But in this particular case, it probably refers to the grave that swallows up every living thing. He's like death itself, taking away the life of everyone, and yet he's never satisfied. And so in his desperate attempt for power to take control of his life, he goes out and conquers other nations and collects people to serve him for his own pleasure. And all this brings the oppressor the very opposite of what he was seeking for. Nothing really satisfies him. And in verse 6, Jehovah introduces this as a taunting riddle. The Hebrew word there is mashal. This is a mashal. It's a type of literature, a form of literature that was common. In fact, it's used in other places in the Bible as well. It's defined as an enigmatic poem or a saying with an important message, but the meaning is somewhat disguised. It's in the form of literature that uses double meanings and irony to make its point. And so the Lord reveals this as if it was spoken by the oppressed himself, those who are harmed by the selfishly wicked. And that's the way the poem is written. There's strong irony in what the Chaldeans will receive for their treachery. What we do to others will return in like manner to ourselves. And so what follows here are 5 stanzas of judgment, woes, pronounced against the oppressors. And the first of these woes is against him who increases what is not his. Begins now continuing in verse 6. Here it says, woe to him who increases what is not his. How long? And to him who loads himself with many pledges. Will not your creditors rise up suddenly? Will they not awaken who oppress you? And you will become their booty. Because you have plundered many nations, all the remnant of the people shall plunder you. Because of men's blood, and the violence of the land and the city, and all who dwell in it. So, the Hebrew word here, translated as woe, is a Hebrew word hoi. It's a term of emotional exclamation, woe. And it has the concept of deep anguish and sadness and pain about something that's observed or experienced, and expresses here the horrors of the judgments that await those who now are oppressing God's people. Well, the first woe is pronounced upon those who increase their wealth or power by taking what isn't theirs. They conquer nations and take the belongings of the victims. They violate the ethic that says what we make, grow, earn, or buy is ours, and that alone. And he asks, how long? Do they think they'll keep all they take forever? There'll be an end to their theft and greedy obsessions. All their ill-gotten gain will one day be gone. All that's going to remain will be their guilt. Then the poem of woes points out the burden that they heap on themselves by the debts they build up. Verse 7 adds the inevitable results of irresponsible living. Eventually, the creditors will demand payback. The oppressed nations will form alliances and carry out revenge on those who have taken their things from them. And those who loot will be looted. History shows how this principle repeats itself over and over again. In this case, one of the victim groups is the people of God who are being oppressed. And the evil gains of the enemy nation aren't going to last. In God's providence, nations will rise up against nation, and the day will come when God will demand a just payment. One day, of course, the promised Messiah will pour out God's wrath on all those who have lived riotous lives without coming in faith to Him. Their sins will surely find them out. The unrepentant oppressors, they'll pay. And their goal was to gain wealth and power and dominion, but their moments of glory will be very fleeting. They won't last. The evil nations' violence will be the cause of their own judgment. And the destruction that comes will be brought upon themselves because of their own human bloodshed and their violence done to the land and to the towns and to its inhabitants. So then the next woe goes to him who gets evil gain for his own house. Beginning at verse 9, it says, woe to him who covets evil gain for his house, that he may set his nest on high, that he may be delivered from the power of disaster. You give shameful counsel to your house, cutting off many people, and sin against your soul. For the stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the timber will answer it. So this next woe that's announced here shows that it falls upon those taking advantage of others for personal gain. And it points out the futility of oppression. The conquering king ruled for his own dynasty. He wanted security for his nation's future and his own family. And so he did all he could to promote his own nation and family while destroying all the other nations and families. Instead of bringing advantage and historic greatness and honor to his house, all he secured for it was shame, because he went about it immorally. His sin was against himself and against his own soul. Sin does not go unnoticed, even though it may not immediately show its results. When we do what displeases God, there will be consequences. The stones and rafters of his proudly built home are going to cry out against him, it says. There's a similar expression in Luke 19:40, where Jesus spoke to the Pharisees who wanted to silence the disciples. And Jesus said, I tell you that if these should keep silent, the stones would immediately cry out. The testimony of God's truth will be given. The Chaldeans had built their beautiful homes by stealing from others. The very building materials in these homes will testify against them. So then in verse 12 it goes on to another woe, and it pronounces woe against those who build a town with bloodshed. Beginning at verse 12. Here he says, "Woe to him who builds a town with bloodshed, who establishes a city by iniquity. Behold, is it not of the Lord of hosts that the people labor to feed the fire, and the nations weary themselves in vain? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea." This third woe announces the futility of those who kill others for their own advancement. The hard work on their glorious cities, unfortunately, was gained by their evil hearts, murdering, shedding blood, plundering, bringing on tyranny. They believe that all they gain is accomplished by their own strategies and power. What arrogance and self-centeredness. They set fire to other towns and homes that stand in their way, and they have no regard for the victim families, their personal memories, or the things they worked hard for all their lives. They worked hard to accomplish their evil, but all their foolish labor is going to be in vain. God himself will make all their prideful labors to be fruitless. They weary themselves for nothing. They labor to fill the earth with the glory of their empire and the stories of their conquests. However, the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, and not with the glory of the Chaldeans. Many today don't even know who the Chaldeans are unless they studied history or the Bible recently. But this also gives us a glimpse ahead in time. Not only will the evil empire here be destroyed, there's going to be a final triumph of Christ's kingdom over all evil. And so then the next woe is announced on him who makes his neighbors to drink, to make fun of them, to humiliate them. This begins in chapter 2, verse 15. Here it says, "Woe to him who gives drink to his neighbor, pressing him to your bottle, even to make him drink, that you may look on his nakedness. You are filled with shame instead of glory. You also drink, and be exposed as uncircumcised. The cup of the Lord's right hand will be turned against you, and utter shame will be on your glory. For the violence done to Lebanon will cover you, and the plunder of beasts which made them afraid, because of men's blood, and the violence of the land and the city, and of all who dwell in it." So this fourth woe is against those who take advantage of their neighbors to shame him. The analogy speaks of getting someone drunk to make him behave shamefully. That term, "look on his nakedness," was a common idiom that was used at that time. And it has to do with seeing a person with his inhibitions down, so that he would do offensive and embarrassing things, getting a joy out of seeing a drunk do foolish things. And instead of shaming the neighbor, the oppressor exposes his own shame because of what he's doing. His reward is judgment against him, instead of an increase of his glory. And while he offers his wineskins to others so that they get drunk and behave shamefully, the Lord's cup will be presented to the offender, not a cup of wine of glory, but he'll drink the cup of God's wrath when the time of judgment comes. Instead of the creation mandate to subdue the earth for God's glory, the oppressed abused creation. They plundered it for their own selfish pleasures. We see that these Chaldeans were violent toward Lebanon, devastating even the trees and animals as they rampaged through for their own glory. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 37, we see some details of this horrible event in verses 23 and 24. Let me read those verses for you. Isaiah 37, 23 and 24. "Whom have you reproached and blasphemed? Against whom have you raised your voice and lifted your eyes on high? Against the Holy One of Israel. By your servants you have reproached the Lord, and said, by the multitude of my chariots I have come up to the height of the mountains, to the limits of Lebanon. I will cut down its tall cedars and its choice cypress trees. I will enter its farthest lands, to its fruitful forest." They trampled upon another of God's creation mandates as they went about this trampling of the trees and the forests. Instead of respecting the image of God, that was stamped on all humans, they killed them. And in the last part of verse 17, it repeats that poetic refrain from verse 8. Because of men's blood, and the violence of the land and the city, and of all who dwell in it. His own violence was causing the judgment that was to come. No one should be deceived, thinking he's getting away with his deceitful deeds. The wrath of God is a certain thing, though it may be delayed for a time. And it's delayed to fully reveal the just punishment and power of God, the one they've offended. The next woe is pronounced upon the person who says to a piece of wood, "Awake," as if the piece of wood was a god or was able to help him in some way. This begins in verse 18. Here it says, "What profit is the image, that its maker should carve it? The molded image a teacher of lies, that the maker of its mold should trust it, to make mute idols. Woe to him who says to the wood, 'Awake,' to silent stone, 'Arise, it shall teach.' Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, yet in it there is no breath at all. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him." Well, this is the final woe, and it's directed to those who treat idols as if they were gods. The poem asks about the worth of these man-made idols. What benefit is there of bowing to things carved out of wood and molded from stone? They can be made to look impressive, covering them with gold and silver, but they're just inanimate objects. They can't do anything beyond what we do with them. Now, in our 21st century culture, our idols are different. There are some who still bow to stone images and wood idols, but those who don't worship such things still elevate material things to places of trust. They trust in things they make or buy as if they're going to bring them their peace, prosperity, and power. Evolutionism, for example, it makes the matter-energy continuum into something eternal. It deifies the very things God made as if they themselves are the origin of the whole space-time universe and all that's included in it. Nature itself becomes the idol. It becomes God. It makes chance and physical law to be the cause behind everything that happens. And it produces a culture in which humans are just evolving animals. And so there are no moral obligations aside from what promotes their own personal benefits. And it closes people's eyes to the real purpose and meaning of life as God made it. I wanted to read what the Apostle Paul wrote in Romans 1:25. It says, of those of this sort, they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Fallen humans make the thing created to be the ultimate good. They reassign the glory of the Creator to the things that He made. And so the last line of this poem ends by stating a very crucial fact. It says, "But the Lord is in His holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before Him." These pompous and arrogant humans exalt themselves and take pride in their evil. They refuse to see and admit this important truth, and it's expressed also in Psalm 11, verse 4. It says, "The Lord is in His holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes behold, His eyelids test the sons of men." The evil king Nebuchadnezzar lifted his own glory high, and he sat on his earthly throne in his palace made from the gains of those he oppressed. But there's a king above all kings, and He has the final say. This poetic portion of God's revelation makes a very clear and important point. Even if we can't understand why God at times allows evil to seem to prosper, no one is going to escape His awesome judgment. Even these boastful Chaldeans will stand one day silently before Him as He displays His eternal sovereign glory. So the 5 stanzas of this poem delivers basically 2 messages. The first to the proud and selfish. To those who neglect God's law and they take advantage of His neighbor to get gain, they're all puffed up in their own glory. They're living for nothing but what they can get out of life. One day they'll be silenced by the Creator they've offended. There will be a payday for the debts they have incurred against God. And the second message is to those who rest in the Lord for their hope in righteousness. They're assured that though even hard and trying times come along, the Lord is in his holy temple. And they know that the Lord provided the only righteousness they could ever have, a perfect Savior dying in their place, God himself in human flesh. And when he died, he took upon himself and paid for the guilt and debt of all those that the Lord had loved before the foundations of the earth. Nothing happens that God's sovereign hand doesn't use in turn for his own glory, and for the ultimate benefit of every one of those of his loved children. There will be ultimate destruction of those who have dared to oppress God's people. It's coming.